I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, as I continue the presentation of central bank independence. Without much ado, I'm going to share my slides. So when the network went off in the previous video, I was explaining functional and operational independence. That when we are looking at functional and operational independence, the central bank has the independence to determine the best way of achieving its goals, including the types of policy instruments to be used and the timing of their use. To achieve its mandate, the central bank must have the authority to run its own operations, and this authority includes appointing staff, the relevant staff, setting budgets, and so on, and to organize its internal structures without excessive involvement of the central government. This is common practice in many developed countries. Even the Central Bank of England was granted, independence in 1997, like operational independence. And then there is personal independence. The other forms of independence are not possible unless the central bank has a high security of tenure. In practice, this means that the governors should hold long mandates, at least longer than the electoral cycle, and a certain degree of legal immunity. One of the most common statistical indicators used in the literature, you may find the literature, is that the turnover rate of central bank governors is taken into account. The government must not have this habit of appointing and replacing governors frequently, as and when they are happy with them or they are no longer happy with them. And then there is the aspect of financial independence. Central banks have full autonomy on their budgets, and some are even prohibited from financing governments in what are known as quasi-fiscal activities. So central banks in many jurisdictions are not permitted to receive incentives from politicians or to give incentives to politicians, because it can be the other way around. And then there is legal independence. Some central banks have their own legal personality, which allows them to ratify international agreements without the government's approval. A case in point is the European Central Bank, and to go to court without really consulting central government. And then there is the issue of de jure and de facto independence. When we are according to WANS 2005, legal measures of central bank independence may not reflect the actual relationship on the ground between the central bank and the government. And the immediate question which arises is, why would that be the case? It is the case because of the difference or the gap between de jure and de facto independence. The word de facto means a state of affairs that is true in reality or in fact or in practice, but is not officially sanctioned. And then in contrast, we've got de jure, which means a state of affairs that is in accordance with the law, that is officially sanctioned. Therefore, taking from those definitions of de jure and de facto, The J, central bank independence, refers to central bank independence in accordance with the provisions of the central bank chart. That is the law. In some countries, it's called the Central Bank Act or the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe Act. Legal provisions or legal statutes, including statutory instruments in a country like Zimbabwe. In contrast, de facto central bank independence refers to the actual independence of the central bank, which is determined by both legal provisions and the relationship between central bank officials and central government senior officials or officers. There is a very strong consensus among economists that an independent central bank can run a more credible monetary policy, making market expectations more responsive to signals from the central bank, according to that source which has been cited there. What are the benefits of central bank independence? Number one, governments tend to make poor decisions when it comes to monetary policy issues. In particular, in the past, they've tended to be influenced by short-term political considerations, like the need to win votes and all of that stuff, which may lead to deficit spending, thereby fueling inflation in the medium to long term. Number two, before an election, the temptation is quite strong for the government to cut interest rates, creating a boom and bust economic cycles, or making them more likely or more frequent. So it's better for monetary authorities to be the ones in control of monetary policy to ensure stability in the economy. If the government has a track record of allowing inflation, then inflationary expectations start to creep up, making inflation more likely, according to rational expectations theory. An independent central bank has more credibility. If people have more confidence in the central bank, this reduces inflationary expectations, thus keeping inflation in actual fact low. The fifth benefit of central bank independence is that evidence has been provided of a negative correlation between central bank independence and long-term inflation, like what I presented on part one of this lecture. A low inflation rate is therefore more likely to be found in countries with independent central banks than in countries where the government interferes a lot in central bank operations. Some studies have demonstrated a negative correlation between central bank independence and the long-term budget deficit. So if central bank independence increases, the long-term budget deficit goes down, ceteris paribus. And if the higher the long-term budget deficit, the more likely that the central bank is not independent. That's what these negative correlative kind of studies have revealed for many countries. And then what are the concerns or disadvantages of central bank independence? We start with the stick rigidly to wrong targets. So when we have a central bank which sticks to wrong targets, there might be persistent unemployment and low economic growth. This has been the accusation that has been leveled against the European Central Bank in Europe. The second disadvantage is that economic policy, when set by unelected officials, may have the potential of being resisted by the majority of people in society. People may start to picket, to demonstrate, and thereby destabilize macroeconomic activity, because their reasoning would be that central bank officials are not elected officials, so they should not be given a lot of freedom to determine the livelihoods of people. And then concerns about the wider impact of monetary policy. The impact of low interest rates on the distribution of income between savers and borrowers is one concern. And then the fourth demerit is that when central banks were made independent, there's been a change in the economic climate. Inflation and booms are no longer a major issue. Instead, the issue is one of secular stagnation and prolonged liquidity trap. In countries like the United States of America and France, they've got a prolonged stagnation by and large. And secular stagnation and prolonged liquidity trap has been reported. So we acknowledge that source of the information that I'm going to present in a study entitled Central Bank Independence and Economic Growth, which was undertaken by Behrooz Gharleghi and posted on 4 March 2019. When we look at empirical evidence, we realize that the degree of central bank independence varies across countries, regardless of the regulatory setup or the health of a country's democracy. But generally, in order to achieve low levels of inflation, it's imperative to insulate monetary policy from political processes. And this entails having a central bank which is independent. So if we maintain the assumption that monetary policies really impacts the real variables, an independent central bank that is free from political pressure behaves more predictably and promotes price stability, which may lead or leads to economic growth. So there is this study of 31 developed and developing countries, which were examined for the period 1970 to 2015, using the fixed effect panel regression method to provide new evidence on the impact of central bank independence on economic growth. So the two variables are central bank independence as an explanatory variable, and the explained variable is economic growth. And it's a panel of 31 countries comprising developed and developing countries. In order to have a fresh insight based on the latest data available, a set of 31 developed and developing countries were examined for that time period. The figure on the next slide depicts the interaction of CPI and growth. Once data is pulled, it shows a negative relationship between the two variables. So when you look at the purchasing power parity, GDP per capita growth rate, and the central bank independence indicator, we see that there is an inverse relationship between the two. In order to see whether the CPI and growth interaction will differ across developing and developed countries, some control variables are introduced which might mediate this impact. After running the regression for the full sample, the panel threshold regression enables us to determine the threshold level of triple P GDP per capita to be $23,000. In this model, the data is divided into two parts, with the purchasing power parity, GDP per capita, above and below the threshold. Then the impact of the CPI on growth, on economic growth, is determined in each group. If the GDP per capita is higher than 23,000, central bank independence has a negative impact on growth. Whereas for other countries with triple P GDP per capita below 23,000, the impact of the central bank independence on growth is positive. So just to provide a summary, of the results, we see that the shadow economy There's a positive coefficient, which is a t-statistic of 1 with a probability of 0.31, which means that coefficient is statistically insignificant. Then the population growth rate has a negative coefficient with a t-statistic of 0.546 with the probability value of 0.075, which is also statistically insignificant. And then government effectiveness has a coefficient of 2.160 with a t-statistic of 0.896, and that coefficient is statistically significant. And then the threshold impact of CPI on economic growth. For countries below US 23,000 GDP per capita, we discover that the impact is positive. The key thing are the signs of the coefficient. We don't dwell much on the statistical significance of the parameters. And then for countries above the threshold, the impact of central bank independence is negative. So what are the implications? The implications are these relationships can be explained through two mechanisms. First, the mechanism is that of monetary discipline. In countries where GDP per capita is below the threshold, mostly comprising of poor countries with bad quality institutions and lack of adequate checks and balances, there is always a danger that the central bank will expand money supply under pressure from the government and or lobbying interest groups. Greater central bank independence provides a kind of blocking mechanism for this type of policy. And then the second mechanism is associated with price rigidities and cost-push inflation. Loose monetary policy, in this case, can alleviate the negative impact of price rigidities on economic growth by ensuring that actual output approaches the full employment level of national income. If the central bank is too independent, it does not care about output and employment, but only about bringing inflation down and stabilizing the exchange rate. And so there is a negative impact on growth. And there are a number of theories that you can think of to explain these two mechanisms. The interpretation suggests that all countries, whether rich or poor, are prone to the second effect, although for poor countries, it may be more pronounced. Whereas the first is extremely important for poor countries, but not for rich countries, where money supply can be increased willy-nilly. So central bank independence prevents unnecessary inflationary pressures in the economy. And then when it comes to price rigidities and cost-push inflation, this may affect both poor and rich countries. Central bank independence may be good for growth in poor countries due to its benevolent effect on preventing excessively expansionary monetary policy, which may lead to hyperinflation like what we experienced in Zimbabwe between 2003 and 2008, culminating in an inflation rate of around 230 million% in 2008. But of course, that inflation rate was stabilized through the adoption of the US dollar and other foreign currencies as legal tender, sort of cured inflation or killed inflation in 2009. In rich countries, the central bank independence also damages growth, despite its benevolent effect on monetary discipline. It prevents too loose monetary policy, and because of its negative effect on the ability of the bank to conduct anti-cyclical policy, allowing monetary easing when actual output is lower than potential. So this is one of the issues that has to be taken into consideration. So the difference with the poor countries is that central bank independence is not really needed in these countries in order to avoid very high inflation and hyperinflation. Though in Germany, along the decades ago, a long time ago, there was also hyperinflation, but in modern times, most developed countries have never experienced hyperinflation of the sort that was experienced in Germany or in Zimbabwe in 2008. Then there is the aspect of the politics of central bank independence. The economic logic behind the delegation of monetary policy to a politically independent central bank has long been theorized in the economic literature. You can see those two authors, Alessina and Stella, who published their work in 2010. Monetary authorities can provide a temporary boost to the economy because the rational economic agents anticipate that temptation. The boost automatically translates into inflation with no gain in output. And so that boost in the long run is wiped out by, inflationary expectations. One possible way to remove the inflationary bias associated with inherent timing consistency of monetary policies to delegate this policy, this aspect of policy to the central bank, whose approach to policy making and implementation would be more conservative. So the other stuff, I'm going to send it to you. I'm going to send you these slides. So now I want to look at the time consistency of the central bank when it comes to its policy making and implementation role. When we are looking at time consistency in the context of finance, it is the property of not having mutually contradictory evaluations of risk at different points in time. So evaluations of risk at different points in time must not contradict each other. That's a technical definition. This property implies that if investment A is considered riskier than investment B at some future time, then A will also be considered riskier than B at every prior time. The time consistency property is a property in financial risk management related to dynamic risk measures. The purpose of the consistent property, the time consistent property, is to categorize the risk measures which satisfy the conditions that if portfolio A is riskier than portfolio B at some point in the future, then it is guaranteed to be riskier at any point prior to that point, up to the present, that is. This is an important property since if it were not to hold, then there is an event with a probability of occurring which is greater than 0, such that B is riskier than A at time t, which is the current time, although it is certain that A is riskier than B at time t plus 1, which may be tomorrow or next week if t is weeks, like the current week t is the current week plus 1 next week, or if t is the current month plus 1, which is next month, April. So the time consistency property deals with that. As the name suggests, the time inconsistent risk measure can lead to inconsistent behavior in financial risk management, thereby leading to exposures of the financial institution. The problem of time consistency is one of the most profound in social science, with applications in areas ranging from economic policy to counterterrorism. It arises whenever the effectiveness of a policy today depends on the credibility of the commitment to implement that policy in the near future or in the future. For simplicity, we define a time consistent policy as one where a future policymaker lacks the opportunity, ability, or the incentive to renege on a decision made in the present. Conversely, a policy lacks time consistency when a future policymaker has both the means and the motivation to break the commitment made today. Policy as commitment strategy. So here we are viewing policy, whether monetary policy or fiscal policy, as a commitment strategy. According to Kitland and Prescott, in their seminal study, they introduced the notion of dynamic inconsistency of a sequentially determined optimal plans in 1977, for which they earned the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2004. They demonstrated that policymakers operating with complete discretion at each moment in time might not obtain the best possible long-term outcome. In terms here, best possible long-term outcome, we're looking at outcomes of policy, including monetary policy. So in important circumstances, it is possible to improve outcomes by limiting discretion, not by increasing it. This startling conclusion is a result of the fact that rather than playing a game against nature, economic and social policy influences the behavior of thoughtful persons or people. Importantly, what people do today depends on their expectations about the future, including their expectations about future policy. Since behavior today depends on the ability of a policymaker to commit credibly to a future course of action, there are important circumstances where long-run economic outcomes are worse if a policymaker has the option to make period-by-period choices without that constraint. So a strategy has to be more than a mere promise, which will lack credibility. If it were a mere promise, there must be the element of commitment, so that in future other policymakers, they will not renege on policies instituted today. The irony of time consistency is that limiting the discretion of policymakers can lead to better outcomes. A simple example is that of kidnapping. You know, paying a large ransom increases the likelihood of a hostage or hostages being released. But this also incentivizes the hostage takers or the robbers in their behavior of making abductions in the near future. So this sort of illustrates the situation which may pan out when it comes to policy making as well. If there is timing consistency in the implementation of monetary policy, that is, if decisions made today by today's central bank governor are not binding in the near future or are bound to be changed by a future central bank governor, this may destabilize the macroeconomic environment, because economic agents who are rational, they will just incorporate the fact that the decisions are just temporary into their expectations of the future or the future state of the macroeconomic environment. So this time consistency concept, it has got an impact on inflation targeting. Inflation targeting is de jure or de facto the prevailing monetary policy regime in many countries that produce about 66% of global output. And it relies on transparency and communication to raise the stakes when it comes to reneging on price stability commitments. Policymakers not only announce a quantitative target for inflation over at least the next several years, but they routinely report to the public, you know, instead of the nation and other types of addresses, how far they are in tracking or realizing their objectives. So that's the end of my presentation. So in the next presentation, I'm going to look at central banking and the globalization of financial markets. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope you benefited from this quick and fast-paced presentation on central bank independence. There's quite a lot to read in the theoretical and the empirical literature. Just to summarize the salient points. Have a good day.